Yeah.
So I think that there's a delineation we need to make too.
Right.
Keeping it simple is the difference between filters and EQs, and they often get like lumped together, but like they are two distinct different things. And as you were reading, Joe, it was talking about filtering frequencies. It mentioned so the filters. If you think of a filter like a water filter, you're keeping some stuff out and letting other stuff pass through. So you're stopping some things, letting others pass. And so there's all these different pass filters. So we've got
like one of the most common and most used, the high pass filter.
Yep. So
Not the low pass filter. No, not the low pass filter, the high pass filter.
Yeah.
We use high passes.
So
I use the low pass pretty frequently.
I use it on some things. But
low pass is more used in like synthesis and stuff like that too, because there's so much high frequency created. But anyways, so what does a high pass filter do, Joe?
A high pass filter gets rid of all those nasty lower frequencies, the subharmonic frequencies that muddy up or create problems. I use them in live sound to get rid of like people touching the boom stand or cut out those kinds of things, cut out wind noise, to deal with some plosive, like, where you have like the air hitting the microphone and causing it to move. It helps deal with those problems. I use them on every track. You should never not use a high pass in a live sound. And well, there's always exceptions, but generally you're going to use high passes on every channel.
Yeah.
I even use it on my kick. Just not that high.
Yeah, it's pretty low. It's like you said, for the subharmonic stuff,
Right.
Yeah. Well, even in the studio setting, I'll use a high pass filter on a kick. So maybe I'm mixing wrong, but
No, I do that too.
So,
it's for the same purpose. Like if
You don't want your kick to
subharmonic stuff.
overpower, and the subharmonics can do that.
Yeah, and there's a couple of funny stories about that. So there's this one story about, I think it was a Grammys show that was being recorded, and they were recording it. The guy who was mixing it was doing it on NS10s because, they're standard and stuff. But he didn't have a sub with the NS10. And so he's mixing it and everything, and he thinks it sounded fine. And then he gets these phone calls from the broadcasting people. They're like, what in the world is going on? And it was like, every time they would move the camera, like boom, like the roller thing for the camera, there was this big rumble, and it was picked up on the mics, and he hadn't high passed them. And so he couldn't hear it because he didn't have a sub on his NS10s.
yeah.
And it was this big rumble was getting through.
I don't hear what you're talking about.
So anyways, there's a couple other fun stories with that. But so that's a high pass filter. It lets the highs pass through and it stops the lows, right? Okay, and then the low pass filter is the opposite. So it stops the highs and lets the lows pass through. And the confusing thing is the alternate names, which is the high cut, which is the same as the low pass, and the low cut is the same as the high pass.
Inverse relationships, my friends.
Yes, inverse. So then there's the band pass, which is basically a high pass and a low pass together, which is like your telephone effect. Okay. And then you've got a notch filter, which is like the opposite, where it just takes out one frequency. So that's the one that's like a notch, a V that you slide back.
That's good for like in live sound applications, obviously removing feedback loops and finding those
Exactly.
problems.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Notch it out.
Good for taking out resonances in a studio setting.
Yeah, like that ringy snare, right? You don't want to get...
No, just gate it harder.
If you don't want that ring. Okay, so that's the filters. And then...
Like actual
EQ, VEQ, and some other EQ. I don't
Well, those are like styles of EQ, but...
EQ.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. You've got like a shelf, a bell.
Yeah, so the bell one, I've heard it called lots of things, like a peak dip is what I usually call it, but it's called a bell too. But it's just where it's like a narrow band, a band of, and that's the one that we were talking about,
With the
Q
Q.
will widen it and stuff.
That's what most parametrics seem to use, is like the bell curve style.
Yeah, so it's just like the shelves and the peak dip or the bell. And there's a high shelf and a low shelf, of course. And so, Bryant, why don't you tell us what a shelf does?
So a shelf will either boost or attenuate all the frequencies at a certain point and up if you're using a high shelf, or all the frequencies from that point and below if it's a low shelf.
It's like you set a point and you can adjust anything from that point over to whichever
And then
side.
all those frequencies will boost.
Yeah.
So
instead of just a certain area with like a bell curve or a peak dip, you focus on a certain area, and so it'll do, if you set one at like 400 hertz, it'll do about 400 hertz plus a little bit more. But if you set a high shelf at like 2000 hertz, it'll do 2000 hertz plus everything above that. And all of that is boosting together.
Also, remember that depending on the EQ that you're using, like either plug-in or the one you have at job, they will either have 2 options, which is gain and frequency, or they might have 3 options, which is gain, frequency, and Q. But the Q with the shelf is only going to adjust how aggressive it's going to adjust from that point down. You know what I mean? Kind of like the knee on a compressor.
Yeah, it's like the slope of the shelf. Is it
the slope?
Is it a sharp cliff or is it a gradual?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you can even have that with like different, going back to filters, like a high pass filter. You can adjust like times 24, times 12 or whatever. And it's just changing.
Like 6 dB an octave, 12 dB an octave, et cetera, et cetera.
And it's just changing how aggressive that slope is. If you want it really like surgical, you're going to use like a times 24 or something like that. If you want it to be a little less surgical, a little bit more smoothly, it's going to be like a times 6 or times 12.
Yeah.
And that like messes with the phase, which you were talking about, the linear phase.
Yeah.
The sharper the slope, the more phase inaccuracy.
The more you have to like do to put it back into phase.
Phase.
Yeah.